Okay, it's me again. Today, we're going to talk about protecting our heart from greed. This is the third straight lesson that has to do with ways we can protect our heart from things that really do it damage and harm. And the reason it's important to protect the heart is because, as Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23 says, the heart is to be guarded above all else because it is the very wellspring of life. Our actions, our thoughts, much of the impact in our relationships all have to do with what's going on in here. So if we keep this clean, if we keep this protected, we end up living a better life, more glorifying to God. We're better at passing on this Christian legacy to our friends and our family and our neighbors. And this is the third part in what will turn out to be a 4-part series on guarding our heart. And I'd like to give one more recommendation of a book written by Andy Stanley. He's an author and a preacher down in the Atlanta area. He wrote a book called Enemies of the Heart, and it inspired this series that we're into right now. First, we talked about guilt. And guilt says, if you remember, I owe you. And we feel bad when we owe people. We feel guilty, and it has an impact on our heart. Next, we talked about anger, which says, you owe me. We talked about that last week. And changes our attitude toward other people and the way we view and see them. It makes us more cynical. And today we're going to talk about greed, which says, hey, I owe me. When we think about greed, that word in and of itself, I don't know, maybe not for you, but I'm thinking normally like most other people do. When we think about greed, it's one of those insidious sins that just feels or seems like it's more yucky than the others. Now, I think mentally we know that sin is supposed to be sin. It's all the same in the eyes of God. It all separates us from God. It's all serious. But sin feels more awful. We can all agree on something this morning. Greedy people are just awful, right? They're just awful. Bottom line, though, is greedy people don't get that way overnight. Greedy people believe often that they deserve every good thing that comes their way. They deserve it. They oftentimes even believe that they deserve every good thing that could possibly come their way. And so they're in search of even more. And there's a strong sense that all that they possess, when I'm speaking of greedy people here, has been earned. And therefore, it belongs to them. It's owed to them because they deserve it. They earned it. It's theirs, therefore, and it's theirs alone. A greedy man can be married to the most beautiful and wonderful of women and have the greatest family life, and yet still lust for more, for beautiful women that he doesn't have. How do you explain this? It's greed. In a greedy heart, there's always room for more. Greed itself can be disguised. And if we look, I think this would be about the fourth slide. I don't have the clicker to control the slideshow this morning. So Jason and Tony, if you forward us to the slide that just looks like a camouflage. Greed disguises itself like this. It's so often camouflaged that we don't notice that it's entering into our heart and into our lives. And some of the ways that it camouflages itself are by taking on more justifiable forms like being careful or being responsible, which are good things, right? And so if greed can look like those things, we can unwittingly welcome it right on into our heart where it can do a tremendous amount of damage. Greedy people are often great providers. Greedy people are good planners. Greedy people are successful at saving for the future. All of those are admirable attributes, right? Greed disguised as good things like these finds its way undetected into our heart. And the next thing you know, it's present, even though we never recognized it was there. Now, could it be that in our pursuit of caution, we've been drawn into that dreaded greed as well? Like those awful, greedy people? Could that apply to us too? Greedy people are awful. Well, I hope not, but I assume that it actually has happened. I know it's happened to me. We can agree that greed is awful, and at the same time, we can fail to see our own greediness. And that is what I'd like us to help uncover this morning, not so that we can feel guilty, because remember, guilt is another enemy of the heart, and we're not interested in feeling guilty. But what we do want to have is a heart that's pure and clean before God. And so it's good to unearth the yucky things that lie beneath or lie within so that we can diagnose it and then treat it, deal with it. And we're going to talk about solutions to the greed that plagues our hearts this morning as well. You know, in a capitalist system, we have about as much chance of escaping greed as a diver has of plunging into a pool without getting wet. And I'm not downing capitalism. It's just a system amongst the many systems. We'll talk a little bit about how greed isn't really an economic thing, actually, because it's the natural tendency of man. But especially when you grow up in a system like ours, where greed is prevalent, marketed to, and accommodated, it's really hard to not be affected by and impacted by it. I want to welcome you this morning to feel safe and to feel at home in our fellowship, even though you may have greed lurking in your heart. It doesn't make you a freak. It doesn't make you terrible. It makes you pretty normal. But the question for us now is, what do we do with the greed that may be lurking in our hearts? Because it is the natural tendency of man. You can see this, by the way, well beyond economics. Just look at a toddler. Before a toddler can even walk, you can see greed in their life, yeah? And their possessiveness, in their crying when they don't get what they want, and their constant desire for more. I remember spoon feeding my son a little bit of ice cream when he was not able to walk yet. And I was eating some ice cream and I shared some with him. And his eyes did a thing I had never seen them do before. There was an excitement over what he had just placed in his mouth that was like, this was the best thing he's ever tasted in his life. And the next thing I know, as I sat next to him and continued to eat ice cream, his little hand, his little chubby fingers reached out and grabbed my spoon as it was on its way to my mouth, intercepting it and pulling it toward his. Right? And so I shared the rest of the bowl of ice cream with him because I'm a good dad. That's what good dads do. But I could see the greed in my toddler, right? It's a natural tendency of mankind. It's not economic. It's not even financial completely. It's a heart issue. Financial gain, therefore, doesn't make greedy people less greedy. We don't reach a certain level of financial security and stop being greedy. And being poor, by the way, doesn't make us less greedy, because again, it's not about the finances. Greed emanates from the heart, not from the bank account. The next slide, if the one that comes after the camouflage slide is where we're moving to next. People were created to be loved. Things were created to be used. I'm going to say that again. People were created to be loved. Things were created to be used. And much trouble comes with the reversal of these two. And they do get reversed, don't they? Sometimes they get reversed, and we can use people and love things. But every time that dynamic develops, every place where it exists, we've got an unhealthy and harmful situation. We're cautioned in the scriptures to guard our hearts in Proverbs 4:23. And to be sure, greed is a particularly sneaky enemy of the human heart. We're sort of seduced into believing, in fact, what we would probably deny out loud, and that is that stuff equates with safety. And safety leads to security and happiness. We're sort of seduced into thinking that. And therefore, once we believe that stuff means safety and safety means happiness, we think, okay, then that means that stuff brings happiness. And if stuff equals happiness, then to tamper with a person's stuff is seen as personally threatening because their stuff is tied to their happiness, and no one wants you to mess with their happiness. We've probably felt this in our own lives. Lost something. It was just a thing. Things are made to be used. But with the loss of that thing, we noticed a marked drop in our happiness. I've totally been there, right? I've seen and heard professing Christians speak without hesitation of conscience about how readily they would shoot someone dead to protect their stuff. Spring of last year, I was asked to give a little devotional for a group of Christian business owners here in Fox Valley. And we did a little Q&A and we did a little devotional thought. And in the discussion that stemmed from the devotional, some of these guys who are professing Christian business owners said, hey, look, I have to protect my business. That is how I provide for and protect my family. And so if someone comes to mess with my stuff and my business, I will have no hesitation to shoot them dead. How does a Christian get their heart into that position? And I'm not accusing anyone of being awful here. This is just something that can happen on some level to all of us when we equate our stuff with our safety and security and therefore our happiness. And I'll tell you how it happens. How does the Christian heart get to that spot? Because greed has an accomplice, right? Just like Batman has Robin, greed has fear. A sidekick of sorts, one who works behind the scenes to make all the things that greed does possible. And that sidekick is absolutely fear. Because fear is what fuels greed. It confronts us with an endless list of what ifs, and it gets us worried. What if there's not enough? What if an emergency arises? What if the economy collapses? What if we need more? If you need any evidence of this, by the way, just try to find a roll of toilet paper in May of 2020, and you'll know what I'm talking about, right? Fear can drive actions that turn out to be just hoarding and greed. When greed gets stuck in the heart, we can become concerned that either God can't or he won't provide for us. We become fearful that he won't provide for us, at least not in the fashion that we want him to be providing. And that gap between what we suspect God might be willing to do and what we want him to do becomes a major source of insecurity and fear in our heart. And that fear, in the name of finer sounding things like providing or being wise, can cause us to withdraw from people when instead the need is to get involved. It can cause us to tightly hold on to things that were intended to be shared. Sometimes our greed is an attachment, or rather is attached to the amount of effort that we personally put into gaining something, right? If you've worked hard for vacation and then vacation finally rolls around and something comes up to interfere with your vacation, you feel angry. You feel a sense of defensiveness, like I have to guard this vacation because I earned it, right? This weekend is mine. I worked hard all week to get to Friday, right? And so don't mess with my weekend. Or I put in a certain number of hours. Look at my timesheet. It says 45 hours this week. I worked a lot. And therefore, that money that was earned is my money because I put in the effort for it. When that happens, our heart feels it deserves or is owed or entitled to a certain amount of time or a certain amount of resource or a certain amount of wealth. We end up with this oversized sense of ownership. The sneaky thing about greed is that because it can so easily camouflage itself as if it were a virtue like hard work or wisdom, We might actually be pursuing the very thing that can damage our own hearts, the wellspring of life. So our question this morning is, what can we do to guard our hearts from greed? And the first thing we can do to guard our hearts from greed is don't assume. Let's turn our Bibles to Luke chapter 12. Thanks for hanging in there with me in the intro while we were on our way to getting into the passage for this morning. We will get into the word right now in Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 15. The Bible says, "Then he said to them, 'Watch out, be on your guard,'" so we're talking about this morning, "against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And then he told them this parable. "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. I've got so much. What do I do?' Verse 18, then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain.'" Whose surplus grain? My surplus grain. Verse 19, "And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. And then who will get what you prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." It's a great parable, and it comes on the heels of Jesus warning those around him to watch out for something, to be on guard against something. What's that thing? It said in verse 15, to watch out for greed. It lurks, it camouflages, and it works its way in unwittingly to our hearts. Right? And he says, your life isn't about your possessions in verse 15. He doesn't vilify possessions. He just tells them they don't define you. They don't define your security. They don't define your happiness. They don't define who you are. Things are things. Things are meant to be used. People are meant to be loved. And then he's inspired by this thought to roll right into a parable. And in the parable, he speaks of a successful farmer. Now, a lot of us have a hard time relating to farmers because most of us haven't farmed. Most of us work in an office or in a retail shop or someplace in one of the service industries, and we put in a certain number of hours, and in exchange for those hours, we get pay. And so it's easy for us to think that we don't depend upon sources outside of our control. We put in X number of hours at X rate of pay, and we get X amount of money. It just works out that way. And so we get dependent upon ourselves. A farmer, however, like the one in this parable, even on the hardest days of work, they realize something. They depend completely upon things that are outside of their control, like the weather, right? The amount of rainfall, the temperature. The farmer knows that even if he puts in his hard day of work, he's going to need things outside of his control in order to harvest. Now, this particular farmer was really successful. He planted something, and it exceeded, the crop exceeded probably what he even expected, what he had the capacity to handle. And then he was faced with a question: what shall I do with my abundance? There's not enough room for it. And he was right to think ahead and to plan ahead. But what he did is he asked himself the wrong question. See, he assumed that all of the extra was meant for him, that the intended target of all that abundance was him. Wrong assumption. Oftentimes, when God brings an abundance into our lives, it shouldn't be assumed that it's for us. And the question shouldn't be, what should I do with mine? It should be, God, what do you want me to do with what you've blessed me with? When you're blessed, it's important to ask the right question. What am I going to do with all my stuff that I've got as a result of my hard work? Or, Lord, what do you want me to do with the excess? Don't assume that it's for you. We work and we earn, and that's great. But when it goes well and you have some left over, don't assume that it's intended for you. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 18 tells us that our very ability to gain wealth comes from God. So even for us salaried employees or hourly employees who exchange our hours and our time in exchange for money or resources, we have to ask ourselves a question: where did our time come from? Did we create it? Do we make our own hearts beat? Did we create our own lives? We don't. We didn't do any of those things. Our very time that we exchange for finances and for paychecks comes from something outside of our control, just like the farmer's comes from outside of his. So even for us who can't quite relate with a farming analogy, we have to understand that what we've been able to earn, even though we worked hard for it, we put in the hours, those very hours that we put in were a gift from God. Lord, what do you want me to do with this extra? That should be our question. That should be our question. If not, then we're a fool, because Jesus said so. There's literally, by the way, a cottage industry that exists for giving people a place to put their extra stuff. Have you ever driven past one of these storage warehouse places where there's dozens and dozens of garage doors, and you can rent a garage door to put your stuff in, your extra stuff that won't fit in your house anymore? Not vilifying it, I'm just saying entire industries exist, and this says something about the amount of excess that we have as a society. Oftentimes those units go unclaimed, and when the person who owned that unit passes on, everything in there either goes to someone else, or if no one else claims it or knew it existed, it goes into an auction. They've got television shows even about those storage units in the auction. At some point, all of our lives get demanded from us, and what we do with the stuff that we had is going to say a lot about whether greed was a permanent resident in our heart. While it's true that the landowner planned ahead in this parable, the thing is, he didn't plan far enough ahead. He planned for the next few years and thought, I'll enjoy the excess, I'll take it easy, I'll eat, I'll drink, I'll be merry. But he didn't take into effect the God factor, or into account the God factor, and that his future extended beyond his time here on earth. In the words of Jesus, he was a fool for that. Albeit a fool that many of us may have envied, or might have looked at, had we known him personally, as a successful business owner, and applauded his efforts by looking at all of his opulence that resulted from his hard work and his great decisions. But he was a fool nonetheless, according to Jesus, even though he may have been a fool that we have the tendency to emulate if we're not alert. Amen? So, just like confession guards the heart from guilt, and forgiveness guards the heart from anger, not assuming everything is ours and being generous is what guards our heart from greed. I'll say that again. Not assuming that everything is ours, and instead being generous, is what guards our hearts from greed. In short, don't assume, be generous. I'm often so proud of so many people in our fellowship because of the generosity that they display in such incredible ways for people in need, and how freely you give to each other. It's an inspiration for sure, and I encourage you to stay that way for the sake of your own heart. If you feel challenged by the idea of great generosity, I want you to be encouraged this morning. You've got other people around you that are a great example to follow. They've proven that average everyday people can be very generous, and if they can do it, you can do it too. Sharing with others, being hospitable, helping the needy, being generous toward God, all these things protect our heart from greed. Proverbs chapter 19, verse 17, which I read at the beginning of service today, tells us that when we lend to the poor, we lend to the Lord. So in being generous to God, part of that includes being generous to those in need. We're going to continue reading here in Luke chapter 12 and verse 22. The scripture says, "Then Jesus said to his disciples, 'Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life. Don't fear what you will eat, about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothes. Consider for a moment the raven. They don't sow or reap. They're not working. They have no storeroom, no barn. Yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable are you than birds?'" I think we know the answer to that question. A lot more valuable. "Who of you, by worrying or by being afraid or giving way to fear, which again is the accomplice of greed, can add a single hour to your life?" You know, the wealthy are just as susceptible to death as anyone else. They can't add, in reality, very much length to their life at all through their hoarding and through their greed. Verse 26, "Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Why live in fear? Why be greedy?" Verse 27, "Consider how the wildflowers grow. Yet they do not labor nor spin. Still, I tell you, not even Solomon in all of his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass that is in the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, then how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith?" He makes a connection that I hope we understand, we catch here. It's a lack of faith that leads to worry, that leads to fear. A lack of trusting that God will provide what we need, whether it's length of days, whether it's amount of food, whether it's how we're dressed, how our basic needs are met. God will provide. And our faith in that is what allows us to not be a captive to fear. There's been so much fear introduced into our lives, especially over this past year. None of us, by worrying, none of us, by being afraid, can add a single hour. Not a single hour. And none of us, by hoarding our resources or hoarding our time or being greedy in the name of being careful or in the name of being wise, can add a moment beyond what God is willing to extend. Now, the quality of those moments can certainly be affected by reckless decisions and reckless behavior. So I'm not wanting to encourage those, right? But let's take a step back and remember that our faith in God is what is going to help us overcome the fear that is the accomplice to greed. He says here as he closes out that the pagan world, verse 30, runs after these things. And your Father knows what you need. But seek his kingdom. Here's the solution. Rather than worrying about those things, seek the kingdom. And all these other things that you need, they'll be given to you as well. Don't be afraid, little flock. For your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure that's in heaven that will never fail. Therefore, rather, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart is also. See, he says it there in verse 33. Generosity is what helps us overcome fear and greed. When we face down greed with generosity, we grow brave. When we're brave, we're less afraid. Bravery isn't necessarily the absence of fear. It's the decision to not let fear overwhelm you. It's doing the right thing in the presence of fear that makes someone brave. When we see things as something to be used as a tool for good and not just for our own good, we don't feel afraid about losing them because they're just things, right? But when we elevate things to the place of bringing happiness and safety, then we naturally have to try to cling to those things and add to those things as much as we can, because those things are our life and our happiness. But the heart is the wellspring of life, not things, right? Fear is often used to motivate our purchases, to influence our votes, to inspire our actions. Perhaps the way to banish fear isn't to feed it by building a better fortress or a bigger barn, but by defeating the enemy of greed head on with generosity. We'll look at one more passage as we close out in Proverbs chapter 13. I want to encourage us to meet the enemy of the heart, that is fear, head on with generosity. Proverbs 13:8 says, a person's riches may ransom their life, but the poor cannot respond to threatening rebukes. In other words, the more you have, the easier it is to worry. And the less you have, because you've given it away, the less you're going to be apt to feel the need to respond to fear. Generally speaking, the more we accumulate, the more we worry. For many of us in America, our lifestyle outpaces our income. And a lot of times that's because of choice, not because of necessity. Some of the things that we decide to add to the pile, we don't necessarily need. We just like them. We desire them. We want them. And yet what happens is they create in us an artificial financial struggle, because we're paying for things we don't necessarily have to have. And then we're worried about not having enough money. And then that adds stress to our hearts. And, anybody who's financially stressed, chances are they're not going to be happy people. They're not going to have great marriages a lot of times. Number one thing that couples argue about is usually money, right? To allow our finances to not be such a drive in our mental state and such an impact upon our heart requires us doing with less, worrying, therefore, about less, and having a more stress-free life. We can tell ourselves that the luxuries we have are actually necessities and things we shouldn't live without, yet instead of bringing the security that we hope that they would bring into our lives, they can oftentimes put that artificial financial pressure on us that actually brings stress. And so just be smart. Ask yourself a question. Should I get this because I can? Or just because I can, does that mean that I should? Does that make sense? I don't have to get this just because I can get it. There are some things that are worth doing without. Giving to the point that causes you to adjust your lifestyle is a sign of a healthy heart. The alternative, of course, is greed. So let me clarify something. Having money isn't a bad thing. Having money isn't a bad thing. It's not knowing why we have money that is a bad thing. And in our wealth and in our financial security, operating from a place of generosity, that's understanding why we've got it in the first place. That's not assuming that it's meant for us, and that generosity helps us guard our hearts from greed. So maybe you're the beneficiary of hard work. Maybe you're the beneficiary of good business sense. Maybe you've made some savvy investments. Maybe you've got a family inheritance. Maybe you just scored a great job because you had an uncle who had a connection for you. There's no reason to feel bad about having money. There's no reason to feel bad about having money when you realize that it's not all for you. When you don't make the assumption that its intended target is your wealth and blessing and security. Since we all have to leave it behind at some point when we pass, one thing becomes abundantly clear. We're not owners of all this stuff. We are merely managers of all this. Some get to manage more than others. That's biblical. There's the parable of the talents. Some get 5, some get 2, some get 1. But none of them are owners, and we're not owners either. As managers, we never have a reason to feel guilty about what we've been given to manage. Let me say that again. As managers, we don't have any reason to feel guilty about what we've been given to manage. What we have is a responsibility. We have a responsibility to manage it well, to manage it appropriately for the one who truly does own it. And who owns it? Ultimately, it's God. So our responsibility isn't to feel guilty. Again, that's an enemy of the heart, about the wealth he's given us to manage, but to feel responsible for the wealth he's given us to manage. As we finish out here, I think the next slide after the Proverbs 13:8 slide tells us we shouldn't feel guilty, we should feel responsible. If you've had a financial advisor, or if you have one who you give a certain portion of your income to, or a certain portion of your money to, and you ask them to invest it, you don't expect that financial advisor to feel guilty that you handed them money. What do you expect from them? You expect for them to feel responsible with it. You are, and I am, a financial manager of God's wealth. No need to feel guilty. Definitely need to feel responsible. Last slide. Let's guard our hearts from greed by being generous. And let's guard our heart from greed by realizing where wealth comes from and that we are merely its managers. Amen. That's the message for this morning. Thank you very much